Baik, selamat siang semuanya. Pada hari ini, hari Kamis, tanggal 8 Januari 2026, senang sekali bisa berada di sini. Ini adalah forum Populi yang pertama di tahun 2026. Tahun lalu, forum Populi yang terakhir adalah di bulan November, ketika rekan-rekan teman-teman mahasiswa dari FISIP Universitas Erlangga hadir di sini. Dan pada siang hari ini saya sangat senang sekali dan kita sangat beruntung ada Profesor Thomas Pepinski. Beliau adalah Walter Lafeber Professor di Department of Government Universitas Cornell di Amerika Serikat. Um, Beliau adalah pakar di bidang perbandingan politik, khususnya Asia Tenggara. Dan untuk teman-teman atau rekan-rekan yang mempelajari perbandingan politik tentu sudah sangat familiar dengan karya-karya beliau. Dan pada siang hari ini, beliau ada di sini untuk berdiskusi dengan kita semua dengan topik tentang demokrasi di Indonesia dan di Asia Tenggara dan outlook-nya di tahun 2026 ini. Jadi pada sesi ini saya akan berbincang dengan Pak Tom selama kurang lebih 1 jam, dan setelah itu saya akan membuka sesi tanya jawab baik untuk para audiens yang sudah berkenan hadir di sini dan juga untuk para audiens yang hadir secara daring lewat Zoom. Nanti bisa disampaikan pertanyaannya nanti oleh tim dari Populi Center. Pertanyaannya bisa ditampilkan di monitor. Demikian. So let me switch to English now. All right. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and thank you very much. So could you explain to us why you interested in Southeast Asia, especially because based on my experience when I studied there, mostly political scientists, especially in comparative politics, they prefer to study Latin American countries, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, or the Middle East. Or now, since the end of the Cold War, East Asia, especially after the rise of China, more political scientists want to study about East Asia and South Asia. And it seems to me, and I think in one of the book edited by Dan Slater, Eric Kuhonta, and Tuong Vu, saying that Southeast Asia is somehow neglected from political scientists in United States. So could you tell us why you become interested in Southeast Asian politics, and yeah, just tell us the story.
Sure. Thanks very much. And before I start, I want to thank everybody here at POPULI for welcoming me. I feel a sense of great pride in being able to join you all today. And I'm very thankful for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. And I think what you have put together here is really special. So I'm glad to be able to contribute to what you all are doing. To answer your question, this is something that I think about a lot, because with our undergraduates and our graduate students, we often hear, what should I study? What should I choose? And they presume that that the answer to my question is a good answer, to your question is a good answer. But it's purely an accident. It's a happy accident. But I will briefly tell you the story. So I became interested in Southeast Asia. The main causal factor is because I had a very inspirational college professor who studied Southeast Asia. I grew up in outside of a small city, Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, which is just a little city in America. And my family did not travel outside of the US. So my parents never left the United States until they were 30. My family was just not a cosmopolitan family, and the town where I grew up was a fairly provincial town. But my grandmother, after my grandfather passed away before I was born, um, she was young when my grandfather passed away, and so her friends, she had also never left the country. Her friends wanted to give her a gift, and they gave her a gift of her first trip outside of the United States in 1976 was to Iran. And so she, a girl from a small town in Alabama, in 1976 flew to Tehran with her friends, and they toured this place. And when she returned home, she had been transformed by this experience. And so she would play a game with me as a kid where we would look at the globe and she would point at a place and I would have to say, what is the capital of that country? So she'd spin the globe and she'd say, if it ended up in Indonesia, I'd have to say Jakarta.
Oh,
And that was a very inspirational time for me because it let me know that there were parts of the world that I could not even imagine. And so when I got to college, I took classes in East Asian studies, Central Asian studies, Middle Eastern studies, European studies, and they were fine. But the professor I had for a class in the anthropology of Southeast Asia was really, really good. And what she did is I went to college at Brown University, which is in southeastern New England, and this is a part of America that has lots of refugees from Southeast Asia, from Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia, and so forth. And so the class involved going out into the community to learn about refugee experiences, and that made Southeast Asia. It convinced me that Southeast Asia is here in America also. Was there in America also, and from there, I just was interested in the region. I had no good reason except for one inspirational professor. And so when I went to graduate school, I thought I was going to write on the Vietnam War using game theory. Turns out I'm bad at game theory, and Vietnamese is very hard. So I decided that I was going to switch my focus to a topic that was more interesting to me and more feasible, and that was economic policy. And I was interested in the Asian financial crisis, which had recently happened, and so I just followed that. It was a series of accidents. I could never have imagined when I was 10 that I would do this. I could not have imagined when I was 20 that I would do this. But because my grandmother had exposed me to the world through her own experiences, and this professor had inspired me to think about something that I could do this, then that's how I made that decision.
so studying Southeast Asia is very challenging. One of the aspect that I myself I encountered is, well, as an Indonesian, I have a comparative advantage of mastering the Bahasa Indonesia. But if I want to become a Southeast Asian, is I have to learn other countries in Southeast Asia and I have to learn about the other country language. So, and Southeast Asia is unlike Latin America. It's not like Middle East in which when you know how to speak Arabic, then it's easy for you to go to any places in the Middle East. Same things with Latin America. Once you know Spanish or you know about Portuguese, then it's easy for you to pick, oh, I want to study about Brazil or I want to study about Mexico. But in Southeast Asia, you have to be very careful on what language that you want to learn for. So why you decided to study Indonesian language or Malay so you can use that language as a research tool to understand the country?
I think you've identified like a really important reason why Southeast Asian studies isn't more popular than it is in the United States, because it's exactly as you say. Because if you want to have a command of the entire region, you have to learn 6, 7 different languages. It's really hard. So people think if I'm going to study a region, I need to study one that's easy. So if you want to study African politics, English and French, Latin American politics, Spanish, and Spanish is close enough to Portuguese. As you say, Middle East, Arabic gives you most everything. But I wanted to do Southeast Asia, and I don't know who told me. It certainly wasn't my advisor. Nobody told me to study Indonesian and Malay, but I just knew like you should probably speak a language if you're going to study it. And I was fortunate that at Yale there was a Indonesian studies professor or Indonesian language instructor, Indrio Sukmono, and he was also a very influential person for me. He was a very good teacher. He was very kind, very supportive, and he was also extremely Javanese, which was very helpful for me to understand Javanese culture and Javanese manners. Um, but that was the thing that I did in I didn't start learning Indonesian until my third year of graduate school. I didn't really understand that was what I was going to do. Um, but it just seemed obvious that you had to learn something. But I will say that one of the consequences of my journey to Southeast Asian studies is that many Americans who study Southeast Asia, I think, have an experience where they go to Southeast Asia first and they travel around and they see every country and they are a backpacker. I never did that. So when I first went to Indonesia in my third year of graduate school, and it was my first time in Asia ever, and I only knew a year's worth of Indonesian, and so I for the beginning of my career I only studied Indonesia and Malaysia, and so it was only last year that I went to Thailand for the first time because I just didn't have experience about the rest of the region. But I was really focused on Indonesia and Malaysia. And I should say, not just Indonesia and Malaysia, because my dissertation was on economic policy, I basically studied Jakarta and Kuala Lumpur. and that and that was it. So I still have not been to many parts of Indonesia before. So I say this to be transparent, that I am very sensitive, very aware of the limits of my knowledge. And that it makes me excited. I have more to learn. But I don't have the experience of having a solid command of Southeast Asia or like memories of all the different places, because that's not how I did it.
Thank you. So, um, speaking of Southeast Asia, like as a professor at Cornell, Cornell was well known for the Indonesian studies, and a lot of Indonesianists were educated and trained at Cornell when George Cahin was there, and the Cornell Modern Indonesia project is very influential in shaping the study of the state of Indonesian studies there. So, could you perhaps update us about what is the state of Indonesian studies, not only in Cornell, but also in among American political scientists or social scientists in general in the US?
That's a really good question. So on the Cornell side, I think the one of the challenging things about when I arrived at Cornell is Cornell's Southeast Asia program more generally was undergoing a generational transition. Benedict Anderson, who was perhaps the most famous Southeast Asianist, aside from perhaps Jim Scott, among political scientists in the United States, he retired in 2002. So there was a bit of a transition that was happening. Also, many of the more senior faculty in other disciplines studying Indonesia and Southeast Asia were also turning over. And if I can speak honestly, I think it was challenging to manage that transition. I was not there for that, but I think it was difficult. How do you follow the footsteps of Stanley O'Connor? How do you follow the footsteps of George Cahin? Who could do this? But I think that we've successfully made this transition. And as a consequence, we've got, I think, by far the deepest Indonesian studies program in the United States, for sure. I don't think that we can beat ANU. I don't think we can beat Leiden. I don't think we can beat Kyoto or NUS. But I think within the United States, we are very, very deep. And so the state is strong. The state of Indonesian studies at Cornell is very strong. And there's been an explicit attempt, pioneered by my colleague Eric Tagliacozzo, to really reestablish the state of Indonesian studies and to like take stock in the different disciplines. And I think that there's some challenges that we're about to face, right? The funding situation in the United States is very challenging. It's worse for everybody else than it is for Cornell, because we will survive the budget cuts from the federal government. I don't think Indonesian studies is very secure other places, but it's secure at Cornell. We also have to change our disciplinary models. And so, like, public policy is one area in which Cornell is investing in Indonesian studies in a big way, and I think that's a big change. The older generation of Indonesian studies people were actually quite politically involved, but very skeptical of American power. I think we retained the skepticism, but we engaged in different ways. I think we need to be more interdisciplinary in the social sciences. One of my colleagues in our Department of Global Development, for example, studies Indonesia from a sociological, geographical perspective, which is very nice. So we're making transitions this way, but I think it's strong. I also would say that we benefit from broader changes in political science more generally. It's when I started as a comparativist studying Southeast Asia in the early 2000s, it was very lonely to be a Southeast Asianist in political science in particular. And that is because I believe the Vietnam War and America's painful experience there destroyed a generation of scholars, which meant that there was maybe a 20-year gap in which there were very few Southeast Asia-focused political scientists who were able to participate in the discipline. And that book you mentioned by Dan Slater, Tong Vu, and Eric Kuhonta, that was a really important volume that came out just before I was an established, or I guess I was still in graduate school when they wrote that. They basically planted the flag and said, yes, we can do this. But what they didn't anticipate, and which I'm proud to have been part of, is that we have not. That book is a little bit reactionary, a little bit oppositional to comparative politics, trying to argue that we need to be rooted in area studies and qualitative analysis. And what I think we've actually done is something a lot more aggressive. Like, we have colonized political science as Southeast Asianists. And so Southeast Asian studies in political science is very strong right now. We have generations now, 2 generations of faculty who have been brought up since I got my PhD, and we now occupy the very center of the discipline, I think, especially in comparative politics. I think of the work of people like Eddie Molesky at Duke on Vietnam, Diana Kim at Georgetown, working historically, Yuki Tajima also at Georgetown. UCSD has a number of faculty, Nico Revanilia on the Philippines, Ceci Cruz on the Philippines. These are people publishing in the center of the discipline, and they are doing mainstream political science, and they're also taking Southeast Asia seriously. And that's, I cannot imagine a better outcome, right? So it doesn't have to be oppositional. It doesn't have to be a reaction or a resistance to mainstream comparative politics. What we've done is we've made mainstream comparative politics accept that Southeast Asia matters.
So you said that Vietnam War destroying political science, and the growth of Southeast Asian studies in the US is, based on what I read, is very closely connected with the US policy during the Vietnam War. And now, if we look at the US national security strategy that's been released last month, and there's a couple of mention about the Monroe Doctrine, or even if we read like the Wall Street Journal or the Washington Post, Donald Trump officials said that this is a Monroe Doctrine. So do you think that with that change in the US foreign policy, it will have a very significant impact on the study of Southeast Asia, or what is your thought on that?
I think it will, but maybe not for the reasons that you think. I don't think, for example, that academic interest in Southeast Asia is purely determined by U.S. government strategic priorities. And I don't know, this American decision in the past month or so to become a regional power rather than a world power is very silly to me. I don't understand it. I don't think it's a good idea. I don't think it's going to last. But, just because the government doesn't care about Southeast Asia doesn't mean that scholars won't. The way it will matter is the cuts that we are facing in the United States to area studies more generally, which are going to be especially damaging for Southeast Asia because studying Southeast Asia in the United States is harder than studying Europe or Latin America, right? So I think what's going to happen, what I anticipate is it's the resource scarcity is going to be a major problem. There are some private donors, I think, who are looking to step up and nurture some of this and to replace federal government priorities. And I also think that a new administration in 5 or 10 years will reverse this because it's really silly the way that this is happening. But it's not that like American foreign policy priorities determine what it is exactly that people study. It's that they determine the funding which is available for that study. So that's what we're facing right now, which I think is challenging. But I will also say that the United States is not alone in the difficult funding environment. So I think scholarship on Southeast Asia all over the world, outside of the region, is in trouble due to funding cuts in Australia, in the UK, in Europe. And the place where it's looking okay is China, right? China has really understands in the way that the Americans used to understand that if you want to be a great power, you need great knowledge, you need expertise. And area studies is a politically valuable thing to do for strategic purposes, for economic purposes. Having an understanding of the rest of the world is valuable. So I think the changes are going to be significant. I think it's going to be a big change. But I don't think that's going to change the level of interest in the United States. Just the ability to do this research, I think, is going to be reduced. But we survived it once before, and I think we'll survive it again.
Yeah, because the government funding is crucial especially in luring the new students to study about the country. Like the U.S. Department of Education has the Title VI, in which it included the FLAS, the FLAS, Foreign Language scholarship, in which it gives money for undergrads to study languages, not only Southeast Asia, but it helps in breeding new scholars who wants to study about the countries. But let's put that aside. So let's move to another topic in which it's still closely connected with Southeast Asia, but it's more general that we want you to explain to us what are the pressing issues in this region, in Southeast Asia right now.
Well, there's a lot of pressing issues, and the answer I'm going to give you is based on my interests, probably, right? So subtract away Tom Popinski's interests before you want to understand the real answer. But I would say that the biggest pressing issue this very moment is anticipating what does Southeast Asia's geopolitical position look like in an era of American decline and Chinese rise. That's been an issue that has been important for 30 years, right? This has been, this isn't new, but it's urgent in a way that it never has been before. The specific implications of actions taken by the Trump administration in the past 12 months, I think that's a major issue. Not because America is the most important, but because the United States has had a really important role in establishing the foundation, the basic assumptions about politics and geopolitically in the region, and that's changing. So that's number one. Number two, economic transition. Now, again, this is really reflects my own interests. But every country in Southeast Asia now, except for Myanmar, is in the process of undergoing a major economic transition at some level, right? So at the top, Singapore has really exhausted, in my evaluation, the economic model of being a trade port, right? To transition beyond being a free trade port and with good rule of law and open economy, it needs to innovate. It needs to embrace the knowledge economy. And I don't think that Singapore has a great strategy. I don't know what to tell them either. I don't have a great strategy, but understanding how to transition to an economy based on dynamic innovation and free thinking and criticism, that's a big challenge for Singapore. The bottom end, so I'm going to take Myanmar aside. That's a different situation. The lowest income countries, Cambodia, Laos, Timor Leste, they have their own economic transition, the modernization problem of moving from a low income primary sector economy to something more established and more like standard middle income sector or middle income type of economy. And that's a difficult transition, but it's easier than the challenge facing what we used to call the newly industrialized economies, from Indonesia to the Philippines to Vietnam to Thailand to Malaysia. The middle income trap is real, and you can see, even within that group, the implications of Vietnamese economic growth on Thailand's economy, right? As the relatively easy era of industrialization ends and the transition from middle income to upper middle or upper income economy status happens, I think that it's really unclear what the strategy that needs to be followed is. And so in all of these different domains, these are big issues. Third issue, turning to Myanmar, is what is ASEAN's future? Right? ASEAN has had two big blows in the past year. One is Thailand and Cambodia. I mean, very, very distressing. Just how not just ineffective but irrelevant ASEAN is for this. This is a big blow to ASEAN. It doesn't mean that ASEAN's irrelevant, but it means that for the biggest geopolitical problems, the exact things that ASEAN is meant to solve, it is like all of my lectures have to change. I used to always be able to say ASEAN members don't fight one another. They can disagree, but nobody kills each other. And now that has been falsified. And then likewise, how to handle Myanmar. It's a difficult situation there. Any country that has that holds the ASEAN chairmanship has to decide how ASEAN engages with Myanmar, and there's no good answer. This is a tragic situation, and it's going to get worse. So those are the third, and then I'll give you one more, and then I'll be quiet. The environment, I think, is a major issue. The world is going to get dirtier as the United States insists on maintaining its links to the fossil fuel industry. China offers a cleaner model right now, focused on renewables. And they're not doing it, I don't think, because they believe in it. They're doing it because it's good economic sense. Southeast Asia, as you know, has an uneven record of environmental management, but it's only going to get more important. As the world heats up, we're going to need to have a good model for how to have energy production which isn't dirty. We're going to have to manage natural disasters. We're going to have to manage climate change, deforestation. All of these things require global solutions, but it's striking how many of them involve Southeast Asia as like a primary point of contact, right? If you are going to save rainforests, you need to involve Indonesia and Malaysia. It is essential. If you're going to save wildlife, you need to involve Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, right? There's no alternative. This is where the things are happening. So I think that's my answer for the fourth one.
Okay, so you mentioned four pressing issues in Southeast Asia, and I think in your recent books. It's an edited volume with Valerie Bones about the challenges of democracy in global world. Um, Southeast Asia is one of an uneasy place to plant democracy. So, looking on that, so what is your take about the state of democracy in this region?
Um, I think the state of democracy in Southeast Asia is obviously quite fragile. Um, we used to talk 20 years ago about democracy expanding in the region because at the time, the number of democratic countries in the region was rising and the levels of democracy in these countries were rising. When I first arrived in Indonesia in 2004, it was unbelievably free and vibrant. Right, there's a lot of challenges. Right, the legacy of the crisis was still very clear, but the sense of openness and dynamism and criticism and silly little things like art production, and then profound things like demonstrations at Monas. This was a time of real criticism and real openness and real competition. And I think right now we feel differently in Indonesia. That story translates to the rest of the world or to the rest of the region. The only country that's been making progress in the right direction, in the democratic direction, right or wrong, I don't know, but the democratic direction is Malaysia. Previously, one of the most durable competitive authoritarian regimes in the world. And it's the ultimate irony that the politician who oversaw a transition from competitive authoritarianism to minimal democracy was none other than Mahathir Mohamad. Um, Elsewhere in the region, though, things are stagnant or they're getting worse. Thailand remains volatile, right? Coup, liberalization, coup, back and forth. The trend lines in Cambodia are negative. The trend lines also in like the more hard authoritarian countries like Vietnam, Myanmar, Laos, Cambodia, also trending negative. And the Philippines remains quite uncertain. Timor-Leste, I think, is a promising case outside of Malaysia, but elsewhere it's not looking very good. So the state of democracy is fragile, and I would say that when a group like us talks about politics, we're really obsessed with democracy, and I am too. I think it's important. In my country, we have problems. In the region here as well, we have problems. But I think that from the perspective of most citizens, most voters, there's a desire for stability, for good governance, for clean, efficient governance, and that is only loosely tied to a desire for democracy. Right? If you could have good governance with a single party government, I think many in Southeast Asia would be willing to accept that right now. I would find there to be a real risk with that for reasons we can talk about. But I think governance is far more important as a practical matter in the minds of Southeast Asians than democracy itself.
Desire for stability and good governance is like a regional trends instead of like a trends specific to any particular country. Is that what you say?
Yes. Now, there's the difference in how this manifests in different countries. Um, in a place like the Philippines, different families compete over power. And when I say that there's a desire for stability, that often is interpreted, there's a desire for my guy to implement the stable form of government, right? But I think broadly speaking, Southeast Asians are looking for governments that work for them rather than against them, that provide the platforms for them to live their lives. And it's just very obvious that the countries in the region that seem to be doing the best, that it seemed to be most easily reaching these goals, are countries like China, in which democracy is not on the horizon anytime soon. So I don't think that China seeks to export this model deliberately, but you can look around and you can see the appeal.
So, speaking of stability, so Bisa ditunjukin yang hasil surveinya Populi. So, Indonesia has a long history with political stability and also have a strong obsession about political stability, especially during Suharto regime. And one of the main actors in maintaining political stability was the ABRI, the Militer Bersenjata Republik Indonesia. And I want to show you this is our last survey, national survey from October 12th to October 20th. And coba dua slide lagi kayaknya. Yang tentang ini kepuasan lembaga. Lagi kepuasan lembaga. So you see here on the right side. So based on our last survey, from scale 1 to 10, which government institutions that you really trust? And the answer is the TNI, Tentara Nasional Indonesia. So, and our pillars of democracy, the House of Representatives, the political party, and the Senate or the DPD is the bottom three, which means that those institutions are the institutions that very not trustable. So, what is your take on these results?
Okay, so I want to talk about the military in just a second. As an American, I look at this table and I think, wow, look how good the numbers are for the DPR. 50%. That's great. Good news. I would love to have 50% support for the Congress in the United States. And that's the lowest. Look, I think first off, let's reflect a little bit on the fact that all political institutions in Indonesia have majority support measured this way. I'd love to see the distribution, right? So this is the numbers that are so some of these might look like bipolar or bimodal, right? Or more polarized, and some may just be flat, and the average is that. But that's interesting. Political institutions in Indonesia relative to the United States are universally more popular. That's an interesting fact about Indonesian politics. But your question is about belief in the military as the most popular political institution. When you ask this question, is that president or presidentan, like the institution or the individual? What is that? How do respondents understand that question?
The institution.
The institution. So the institution of the presidency, kepresidenan. That's what you're asking here. I think that first off, I'd say this doesn't surprise me at all. This accords with my understanding of things. But I think that to interpret what this really means, I would want to know what respondents are associating this question with. So, for example, ambil contoh. So, if people see this question and they think, who would I go? That this question means like, if there was a flood, who would do anything about it? That it's not surprising to me that TNI is the most trusted institution, or the one that has the highest levels of support, because indeed TNI is the most effective national institution at doing that thing. And I would not ask political parties to do that. It could be, for example, that respondents are thinking about these things and thinking in the domain that is responsible for. How much do you believe in this thing? So then you would say that they believe that the military, they believe in the military because the military is good at doing military things, and they don't believe so strongly in the DPR because the DPR is not good at doing DPR things, but those aren't the same things, and so the question functions differently depending on how individuals respond. But look, it's really this is a legacy of the new order. The new order is the thing in which the military brought stability, and Mao not Mao, however, whatever the nature of that process, good or bad, costs and benefits. I have plenty to say on those things if you want, but it is undeniable that many generations of Indonesians lived in a world in which they imagined chaos. They imagined famine. So many of them remembered chaos. They remembered famine. They remembered hyperinflation. And they associate TNI and the president as the things that the institutions that were responsible for bringing that to a close. And I think that is a fundamental aspect of Indonesian political culture that I don't know how to compare that. There's just no equivalent. The question couldn't be asked in the United States the same way, right? What would the question be like? How much do you believe in the military? Well, because it never had that role in the United States. But that doesn't surprise me. I think it really is surprising to me how much trust there is in these institutions. But then looking at the other ones, KPK at 69%. Okay. Mahkamah Agung at 64.5. Okay. Kejaksaan Agung. These are very high levels of support for institutions that have been under great stress in the past couple of decades. And I think the thing to take away from this, which I think is a very fundamental comparative point, unlike previously, is the state in Indonesia remains present and trusted in the lives of Indonesians. Right? The state and its institutions are part of the Indonesian sense of what makes the state the state.
Yeah. So speaking of the legacy of the new order, other than the dominant role of the military in stabilizing as a stabilizer of politics, then what are the other legacy of the new order that really have a huge impact on the current state of Indonesian democracy from your perspective?
So I'm going to do this analytically. I'm going to answer this question without trying to put a normative interpretation on it, but I can if you want. So I'll do the analytical answer first, and then if you want to ask about is this good or bad, then I will.
Oh yeah.
I can tell you what I think. So military, of course, TNI, ABRI, TNI for sure. Another one is the Berkeley Mafia, economic policy making in this country. Right. This is a big legacy. The transition from the sort of sclerotic and disorganized policy making in the late years of Sukarno, replacing that with macro level policy making that is fairly pragmatic, but also realistic about what economic policy can and cannot do. And establishing macro level conditions that are fairly stable and fairly reasonable as a platform for economic development. That you can see that running through the new order and after the new order, right? So I see major economic policy figures, Dede Basri, right, Mengistu, Sri Mulyani, as continuing on a tradition that has existed. The technocratic form of management that provides high-level macro stability in general. Of course, 97, 98, there were some problems. But even then, the technocrats were, I think, quite honest with the government at the time about what needed to be done. And the resistance was political, not technocratic. Um, Another one is like Bapenas and Bulog. So like the the foundations of like of a social welfare system that very underdeveloped in forms of in things like social welfare um, in the kind of like Western European sense. Um, but it is clear that Indonesians no longer believe it's legitimate for people to starve. There should not be famines. There aren't anymore. And that is something that was not true in the 50s and the early 60s. So that's a major change, I think. And that legacy has continued. There's a PhD student in the US, Dewi Devi, who's writing on stunting policy. And it's a very interesting dissertation that studies how in the 2010s, the stunting as a policy problem was identified. And the Indonesian government has taken really good steps since then to address that. So, this idea that food distribution and food availability um, to benefit ordinary people eat throughout the archipelago is valuable. I think that's something that comes from the New Order. And I don't. It's not that the predecessor to the New Order didn't want that, but they didn't know how to deliver it, or they didn't make choices that made that possible. I think that you also see this with things like infant and maternal health, family planning, vaccinations. All these things are quite effective, and these are things that continue for the New Order. Um, and then finally, again, purely analytically, um, the a kind of corporatist model of social organization that conceptual. This didn't start from the New Order, but it was perfected in the New Order. That conceptualizes Indonesians in group terms rather than just individual terms. So the liberal democratic pluralist democracy has never been a model that has taken root in Indonesia. But the idea that you can understand the types of Indonesians by understanding their characteristics, and that we think of what group one falls in: profession, class, religion, ethnicity, region. That there's like discrete types of Indonesians, and you can organize them this way, and that the Indonesia comes out of these types of Indonesians. That Indonesia is made up of kinds of Indonesians rather than Indonesian individuals. I think that's a model of social organization that really was perfected. The idea emerges late in the 50s, but it was actually institutionalized and perfected under the New Order. And that is very, very clear here. Think about the fact that you had to have you had to pass a law to allow people to register themselves as Confucian. That's a big, that's something that like you don't regulate that question in many other countries, but that's something that comes from the New Order period, and today you can see the legacies as well.
So, what about the New Order relentless efforts in trying to uprooting the power base of the political parties and the politicians? So, in Indonesians, we call it deparpolisation or depolitisasi. And because over 32 years, I would say it's more than 32 years because it's already started in 1959 since the uh, presidential decree to turn back to the 1945 constitutions. It really uprooted the politician in which it's hard for them when the democratization in 1998 opening the gate for free and fair elections, especially since 2004 and 2005, with the direct election in the districts, which force the politicians to you need to build your mass base. You need to go to the kampung, to the villages, to build a connection with the masses, in which this was heavily limited during the New Order. How do you see that? One aspect that have an impact on the high political costs in Indonesian election right now is a function of depolitization and also uh, the uprooting of the power base of the political parties and the politician. What is your take on that?
So here's a case in which I think there's a family resemblance between the New Order and the contemporary period, but that's not a causal link. So I don't believe that the current deparpolisasi of Indonesian party politics is the same thing as the New Order's forced conglomeration of all parties into two opposition parties and one ormas. They are similar in their consequences in certain ways, but I don't think they're the same at all. I think that the way that the New Order regime understood political competition was that there should be a voice for this type of person, and that there should be a voice for this type of person, and then there should be the voice of the state. And Golkar was that, and P3 and PDI were the opposition parties to represent this type of person and to represent this type of person. I don't think that the contemporary sort of control over political parties exists for the same reason or in the same way. I have plenty to say about the previous administration's interference in party politics, but that is subordinating parties to the president, the whims and interests of the president. But parties are meant to function not as like either the center that encompasses the state's interests or the opposition parties, which allow for some expression of resistance or opposition, but rather parties are meant to be, to the extent that there's anybody thinking about this on purpose, they're meant to be, vehicles for people to enter politics, but not to challenge the central government. So the presidency. So I would love someone to argue against that position that I just stated. I would love to read a paper that argues that the deparpolisasi of Indonesian politics today is a consequence of the New Order, but I don't think it is. I think it's a different process that has sort of similar outcomes in the sense that nobody believes the political parties are working very well, but in different ways and for different reasons.
And speaking of political stability, bisa digeser ke yang kandidat presiden. Yeah. So this is the result of our survey, national survey in October. And on the left side is about the top of mind about which one that you will vote for the next president. And President Prabowo Subianto is still at the top of mind among the respondents. And we have Deddy Mulyadi, the governor of Jawa Barat, Anies Baswedan, Joko Widodo, still there, Agus Harimurti Yudhoyono, Gibran, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, Ganjar Pranowo, and Purbaya Yudisadewa, technocrats, is there too. And so if you read this result, how you interpret this, like what the Indonesians, as a voters, what kind of leader, what kind of president and vice president that they want to see? Are they still have a strong desire for political stability, or what type of leaders that Indonesians want? From your perspective,
From my perspective, I suspect that people don't have a good answer to this question in mind. And so what they're responding with is the one that they think about. And so the one they think about for the president is the president, right? Okay. So that's why Prabowo Subianto is the answer here. And if they don't like Prabowo, they think of, who are people who are in the news as being like the most plausible opponents. And so that's Deddy Mulyadi and Anies Baswedan. So I bet you that this question functions as like an attention check. And then you have a couple people who are, Mahfud Md, Susi, Ganjar. There's some other ones as well. But what you're picking up here, I suspect, is like how politically aware are people? And if they're not aware of anything, they just pick the one who's the current president. Um, I I'm reluctant to conclude from this that there's a desire for political stability because the plurality of the votes go to the sitting president. It's not a huge number. This is not a dominant performance by the current president. Um, you take this the two, three, four, put them together. That's more than number one. Um, I think. Yeah, math is hard, but I think it's the second three, the two, three, four together is bigger than the first one here. Um, and I think that I really don't think this tells us about interest in political stability. Um, I do think it tells us something, however, about in a presidential regime such as Indonesia's, the identity of the president is the most important political thing. And so it's really about, and like it's like what name do you associate with the presidency?
Bisa slide yang selanjutnya yang partai. Nah, does it also translate to this? So the party of the president that is come to the top of mind, because we see Gerindra here, the party of President Prabowo Subianto. Is that also the same logic also works here?
Yes, I think so. This is like it's very, I think what's interesting about this is not what I would have met. I'm surprised that Gerindra is this high. Normally, like if you look at vote shares throughout the Democratic era since 98 or seat shares, that's higher than the percentage of seats that any party has ever held in the DPR. So it's interesting to me that is as high as it is, and maybe that is something about the fusion of Prabowo with the political party. But to me, what's very interesting is that PDIP and Golkar are still number 2 and number 3. Those are the authoritarian legacy parties, right? From the New Order. Right? Those are the two parties that are still the most like widely known. And so I think what this is showing us is the legacies of party politics really matter still, but really as brands. Right? I don't know, and I'm honestly curious, maybe you can tell me, if voters really believe that there's a distinct policy that you would get from PDIP versus Golkar, or if one looks at PDIP and what you're really looking at is the symbolism of the Sukarno family and the nationalists, sort of social democratic socialist, that sort of type of voter favors that sort of party. I often speculate, if I were Indonesian, which party would I vote for? And I won't tell you the answer, but I will tell you that the answer does not depend on what policy will they implement. It depends on what is the party that's most like the type of person that I am.
So it's more about cleavage.
It's about cleavages, yeah. That's one of my big beliefs, is that these parties represent types of people and types of Indonesians. Or like it's sort of like a modern aliran, right? And there's probably too many parties. There's not that many aliran. And so some of this is the fact that you divide the Islamist vote in various different ways. But at any rate, that's sort of how I think about it.
Okay. So it seems to me, like based on your explanations, on your perspective, that Indonesian presidentialism is political capital, like our political design choosing because this is my perceptions, my own perception based on my conversation with colleagues here and reading from the news, that I don't think that people keep comparing that all of the presidentialism are the same. So when I explain to my colleague about oh, the president in the US has some limitation, like even in choosing the Secretary of State or one of the member of the cabinet, it needs an approval from the Senate, and people just they shock like, oh, does the U.S. presidents need approval from the legislative? Yeah, so because they thought that presidentialism is like here, like the president can choose whoever that he wants. So and it's all of the power is centralized in the presidency. Reformasi try to separate that, to deconcentrate, to decentralize power to other um, political institution. But still, as we see in our recent survey that the presidency as a political institution is very strong. So, do you think that um, this is a good institutional design for democracy in Indonesian context, or do you have another thought on that?
So I've thought a lot about the what institutional design would I recommend for Indonesia.
Mhm.
Um, and I want to be very clear that this is a choice for Indonesians to make, not
Yeah,
for
of course.
Westerners to say. And I also just let's be clear. I live in a country that has poor institutions right now, also, and I'm not particularly pleased with the way that institutions work in the United States right now either. But with that caveat in mind, um, if I could recommend a change for Indonesia, it would be to parliamentarism, away from presidentialism. Right? I think at the root institutional problem, the root institutional feature that explains features of Indonesian politics more generally is the fact that you have proportional representation in the legislature with a presidential form of government, which means that you're going to have multi-party there's not unlikely to be a legislative majority in any party, and so every government has to be formed. Every legislative majority has to be formed through a log roll, right? Which is going to encourage oversized coalitions. And oversized coalitions are very bad at representing particular interests, right? They tend to adopt lowest common denominator policies, and they don't feel very responsive, right? And Indonesia represents the limit of this. When every party is in the coalition, it's not a coalition anymore. It's just the body itself. And I think that's enabled by the fact, like in a situation in which the legislature chose the head of government, you would not have oversized coalitions. What would happen is you would have coalitions that form along a Dutch model or an Israeli model, in which you have parties would try to find a minimum winning coalition, or maybe a slightly larger than minimum winning coalition, and there would be a governing coalition and an opposition coalition. And I think that when many observers of Indonesian politics diagnose and they observe what's wrong, they say, well, why isn't there an opposition? And the opposition doesn't exist because the proportional representation combined with the presidential form of government makes that impossible, or makes it unlikely, makes it difficult. Many Americans, interestingly, I think I've mentioned this before, many Americans want proportional representation in the United States. And they don't like hearing what I say, which is that if you have proportional representation in the United States with a presidential form of government, our politics is going to look like this. It's not going to be what you think we're going to get. We're going to have something which looks a lot more Indonesian than British, right? Or not British, than Dutch, right? Or German. But I think that but I want to also emphasize there's a lot of features of Indonesian form of government which I think are quite good. I think proportional representation is essential for this country. I think it's a really important thing to have. I also think that the nearly universal rule that parties must be nationally based is a really important rule for a diverse country in which geography interacts with other forms of social diversity. I think that's a really good rule. so there's a lot I think to recommend. And there's like, people often talk about campaign finance reform in Indonesia, and that's a really important thing too, I think. But if you were to make one change that were to 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 make politics, I think, more responsive to the interests of people and to disincentivize parties being just labels, I think it would be to implement a parliamentary form of government. And you could keep a president. You could have a president that has a ceremonial function. That's many countries have a ceremonial president. Germany has a model like this. Israel has a model like this. It can work quite well. But in this case, I think the fact that presidentialism exists with multipartism has exactly the consequences that Mainwaring identified, was that this is a difficult combination.
Thank you. So we already reached 60 minutes, but before I open the session to the audience for a Q&A, let me move to another slide. Bisa slide yang pilkada langsung. Yeah, yes. So this is our national survey result about the direct elections. So the respondent answers. So on the left side is about the legislative election. In the middle is about election of the governor in the provinces. And then on the right side is election of the head of the district, Bupati and Wali Kota. And like almost absolute majority, yeah, more than 90%. The respondent wants direct election pilkada langsung for the district, and the provinces almost 90% want pilkada langsung as well. So do you think that this has been around for some times, and now the magnitude on this issue is getting bigger because this year is an election year in terms of the legislation, because the new draft on the election law should be discussed and should be passed by this year. So what is your take about this result, like direct election or indirect election? So with the looking back on the socio-economic context of Indonesia, which one is better for Indonesian democracy from your point of view?
So I'm going to argue the exact opposite than what I argued about national level elections. At the national level, I just argued for indirect elections, right? At the local level, I don't know how you could recommend democratically anything other than this, right? Just like if the people want it this much, if it's this popular, I don't think that there's an argument to overturn public opinion in this way. But I also suspect that the nature of direct elections at the local level is different than the nature of direct elections at the national level, right? It's a different level of politics, and so there's different strategic and political implications. I view the removal of direct elections for local heads, in particular for Bupati Wali Kota, I view that as an effort to centralize power in Jakarta. And I think voters understand that also, that this would be an opportunity to remove popular voice at the local level. There are places where this exists, but it's clear to me, and it's clear to Indonesians, that direct elections for local heads are like a really important way for people to hold local heads accountable, right? They want to be able to punish directly their mayor, and they want to be able to punish directly their governor. But at the national level, I think the logic is different. I think the one of the weaknesses of Indonesian democracy is it's very hard for voters to hold politicians to account at the national level, because they only have one opportunity every 5 years, and it's hard to even signal that they're upset through elections. So just on purely democratic grounds, I cannot imagine a democratic argument against following the popular will, given that it's this strong. And I would actually like to hear, I don't have the argument myself, I would like to hear somebody make the alternative argument. I'd like to hear somebody say, why is it better to not follow the popular will on this issue, given how universal this is? I don't think there's a single thing in the United States that is as popular as direct elections for mayors in Indonesia. 94.3%. I don't think that I can't think of a single thing that's that popular. That's really meaningful.
There is also an argument that, okay, let's keep the direct election at the district level, but at the provincial level, let's just the provincial legislative or provincial legislator that choose their governor. What do you think? Like a mix kind of design, or even a more extremist. So let the president give some names and provincial legislator choose the name given by the president. So what do you think?
Well, that second option I think is a bad idea. I don't think that's a good idea. Why? Because we know exactly what the incentives are. The incentives are for the president to only give names that will do exactly what the president wants. And if the local legislature cannot generate its own names, then it's not that's not a choice, right? Again, I go back to these numbers, right? Voters want to choose their governors. That's very important. I am curious as to how much of this is like people thinking about Jakarta, which has a governor, not a mayor, right? So maybe that's part of what's going on here. And I think it would be inappropriate for Jakarta in particular to not have a governor who's chosen by the people. That would be a very odd model, not unprecedented comparatively, but it would be a very odd model. But you know, I think that given that the majority of policy autonomy in Indonesia at the moment, under the 99 decentralization law, lies at the kabupaten kota level rather than the provincial level. If you had to get rid of one of the direct elections, I'd get rid of the provincial one. But I don't see any demand among the Indonesian population for this, and I don't know what problem that solves. Like, I don't know what is the pressing issue. Again, the argument I'd be curious to have someone defend the point that it's a mistake to elect your governor. It's a mistake to elect your mayor. I actually think a far more provocative but defensible argument is that you don't need a DPRD at all. You're in a unitary state. The function of the local legislature is a little bit unclear relative to the mayor. I wouldn't defend that, but like I find that more plausible than getting rid of direct elections.
Election. All right, thank you so much. So let's open the Q&A session. So I will start from our audience here who wants to. So okay, so so I think I will pick one of you to ask a question, and Pak Tom can directly respond to that instead of I collect all of the questions, because I will forget what questions that they ask. So okay, so I think ladies first. So who want to ask? Okay, Nurul.
Thank you, Mas Azri, for the opportunity. First of all, I will thank you for Pak Tom coming today to Populi Center, because you give me so many great insight about Indonesian politics. So, Professor, I would like to ask you about how Indonesian politics today, that Mas Azri mentioned about high political costs. So, I argue that political competition in Indonesia is expensive. So political access tend to concentrate among the elites, because competition is always about the money resources. But my research suggests that money is powerful, but not always decisive to win the election. Because Indonesia, we have the party have a strong ties with the organization, Islamic based organization like PKB and PAN. I argue that using or rely on the resources using the organization, we can reduce the political cost. But I also see the difference variation, like in PAN, although they have strong ties with the like Muhammadiyah, this not happen in PAN cannot translate this organization ties to winning the election because maybe PAN cannot different ideology with the Muhammadiyah, but PKB have a good, strong and ideology with the NU. But I see that my organization resources still matters to reduce the money politics. But I still thinking, in your opinion, what under condition organization resources, especially political party that have strong ties with the organization, can matters to reduce the money politics. So our politics today can more open and can be more representative to the voters. Thank you for the opportunity.
So, yeah, you can respond directly.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I have like two different perspectives, two different answers. Because I think, I believe that your question presumes that you can't get rid of money politics, right? That's impossible. If we assume that you can't get rid of money politics, then then the question is, how do you increase the role of social organizations? How do you increase the role of other forces, media, in helping people choose who to vote for without focusing on politics? Now, without focusing on like resources and money and things like this. Now, I want to say, I'm very convinced by recent research that I've seen that says that money politics is not in Indonesia is not really about buying votes. It's about buying the ability to be a candidate, right? And so there's actually an equilibrium, if you want to think this way, in which everybody bribes everybody, and then voters can choose, right, on their own, right? So in that sense, like the problem is not that social organizations can't shift votes one way or the other, because voters do still have autonomy to vote how they feel, and they've received bribes from everybody. So it's, there's no reliance on any one party at all. But hold that aside, I still think it's one thing that can happen is I think at the very root there need to be better local sources of information in the form of free and competitive media. Like, that would be the one thing that I would do. And I want to emphasize, I also want that for my country, because we do not have free local media in ways that allow people to form good understandings of parties and politics. But the other way to answer your question is to say, let's get rid of the money politics altogether, right? I think that many of us assume that that's hopeless, that there's no way to get rid of money politics. And I sort of share that view, but like, what if we wanted to get rid of money politics for real, right? How would we do it? I think that we should have audits in Indonesia. You should audit every single candidate's finances, right? And that should be compulsory. And the penalties for not complying with the audits should be you're ineligible to vote. I get this idea from a political scientist named Piro Stanic, who works primarily in Europe, but his wife is Indonesian. He has some research in Indonesia. And Piro always says, in his Italian accent, in his smoker's voice, if you want to get rid of the money politics, you will have audits. You should audit. And he's right. I think that you need to have clear, transparent financial accounting. And it's hard to do, and there's a lot of reasons why that's unlikely to happen. But let's not forget that we don't have to live in a world in which money politics rules every election in Indonesia. Right? There are two different ways to do this. Ideally, we would do both.
Thank you. So, let's move to the questions posted on the Zoom. So we have three questions. Three requests actually. But I think the second questions by Garda Ramadito is an interesting one. So after more than 25 years of reformasi, we are seeing a death by 1,000 cuts regarding decentralization. Why have local leaders so readily traded their autonomy for closeness to the center, at least from the fiscal side? And to what extent is this re-centralization a driver of Indonesia's broader democratic decline? So, yeah, I think this is a good question.
Garda, it's nice to see you again as well. That's a great question. So I agree with your evaluation of death by 1,000 cuts to decentralization, and I would say that the main reason, like the core explanation for why leaders are willing to trade autonomy for closeness to the center, is that there are some downsides of decentralization, and there have been some real challenges. Decentralization, I have early work with Monica Wiharja, who's I don't know where she's affiliated now, but she's an Indonesian economist with a PhD from Cornell who worked for a while for the World Bank here, decentralization support facility. And we found in studying Indonesian decentralization that decentralization didn't empower all districts equally, but it rather empowered districts to evolve in their own trajectories. And so well-governed, prosperous districts did better under decentralization, and poorly governed, less prosperous districts did worse. And so you can look at decentralization and identify real problems, right? So it's not surprising to me that there's resistance to decentralization, because it hasn't been unambiguously good. Why have local leaders so readily traded their autonomy for closest to the center? I mean, you know why. It's because there's money involved, because there's real resources. And one stands to benefit quite a bit from, as an individual, right, with a short-term perspective, individual perspective, from trading autonomy for resources. Finally, to what extent is this re-centralization a driver of Indonesia's broader democratic decline? I really think that this is a kind of like endogenous ratchet effect situation, in which the core driver of Indonesia's democratic decline is not re-centralization. That's not the core driver of it. But in the context of democratic decline, re-centralization is definitely making it worse. It accelerates the process of democratic decline. So you cannot tell the story of democratic decline in Indonesia without taking into account the challenges to local autonomy that have happened from the previous administration to the current one.
Thank you, Dr. Pepinski. And I will turn to our audience here. So anyone have a... Okay, Pak Yugo, please.
Thank you very much, Pak Tom. Actually, I don't really understand about democracy. Since you the expert of democracy, I have many things. I'm quite curious when you explain about democracy and military. On our survey, our DPR on the lowest position, while our TNI in the first position. I do really understand why our military in the first position, because they exist for our citizens. They are there when our society need help, while our DPR as the opposition place for our citizen. But the question also about our military, maybe you quite familiar with the term of koter, Komando Territorial. They quite they has closely relation to our society because they get involved in domestic social politics. So the question is, what kind of institution in your country that in the first position based on the survey, because you said yeah your DPR also in the lowest position, so what kind of the trustable institution in your country that put in the first position, and what kind of their influence in domestic social politics in your country? Does America has the same pattern in the trustable institution based on the survey? That is the first position. The question. The second question, based on the perspective of democracy, the involvement of military in Qatar, because put they quite busy doing or getting involved in social domestic other than training for war, because you said that your military in back to barak or back to basic, while our military not really back to basic but also sometimes get involved in social politics. How it endanger democracy in one country, especially in Indonesia? Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you, Bob. So I'll try to answer your questions. I have to apologize though. I really wish I had data from the U.S. on trusted institutions. I don't know what institutions are most trusted in the United States right now, but I can tell you that the most trusted institutions certainly will not have higher trust than like 60%, probably less than that. Nothing is trusted that much in the United States. Maybe the NFL, the National Football League, and maybe the Major League Baseball, but even that, not Americans hate these institutions too. So it's very hard for me to think of anything that has high levels of trust in the United States. And I also don't know what is the ranking, right? If anybody has access to Pew data right now, you can probably look it up. I just don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's striking how trustworthy how trusting Indonesians are of their national political institutions. It's just very foreign to an American. Right? We are really a country that distrusts broad institutions. I think possibly there would be a lot higher support in the United States for local governments, right? There would be a lot for the institution of the governor, right? In a federal system, like your region might be something that you care a lot more about than in a unitary system like the United States, like in Indonesia. I will say that although the United States does not have a military structure that's exactly like Indonesia, there is a part of the American military structure that does exist, that fulfills a similar function, socio-political function, as the military in Indonesia. So we have the regular military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. We also have reserves, and so people who are reserve soldiers. And then we also have a National Guard. National Guard is a military force that is controlled primarily by the governor of each state. And their main responsibility is to do public safety and law and order tasks in the event of a disaster. So if there's a flood in my state, the governor can call the National Guard locally to do the work of responding to, directing traffic, cleaning up, saving lives, treating victims, and things like this. So that does exist. But the National Guard also can be federalized. So the federal government can take the National Guard and activate it. And in the United States right now, there's this major debate about, is it legitimate for the federal government under Trump to use the National Guard to do immigration enforcement? And one of the most significant losses that the Trump administration has faced is that the Supreme Court has said that the Trump administration may not compel states to accept National Guard troops. So that's kind of an interesting thing. But just a detail that sort of shows how even in the United States, there is a thing that's like the military. And I wonder, I'd be very curious to know if how supporting citizens are of their state National Guard. Because I suspect, I personally trust the National Guard in my state quite a bit. Because their function is to save my life, primarily, if there's a disaster. And they will do that. They're well trained. Your second question is about, could you please remind me, Pak?
Okay. The second question is about our TNI, not only getting involved in our society, not for the flood only, but sometimes they get also involved in domestic social politics. They the term that we use is Koter, Komando Territorial, for Korem, Kodim, Koramil, even Babinsa. They are in our society. They also take the participation in social politics. The question is how it endangers democracy, the involvement of military in social domestic politics.
Thank you. That's a great question. And the answer is, in my opinion, that involving the security forces in a socio-political role is a major threat to Indonesian democracy. And it was a major threat to Indonesian democracy when it happened under the new order. And it's a major threat to Indonesian democracy when it happens in the Reformasi and post-Reformasi period. One of the major amazing victories of the Reformasi era was the separation of the police from the military. Right, that's a very, very important change, and also the reduction of the military's the military TNI, their responsibility for providing basic functions, for playing a social political role, doing things beyond securing the population, but also just like being an actor domestically. In my view, the role of the military is to defend the country against external and internal threats. It is not to be a political actor. The actors who fulfill this role, maybe they should be civilian. They must be civilian, right? And I think that the fact that Indonesia is a unitary rather than a federal state, and the legacies of the new order, as we talked about previously, is why it is so easy and so familiar to Indonesians to have the military playing a social political role. And it was a threat, as I mentioned, it's a threat today in the same way as it was a threat in the 1970s and 1980s. And I'll again compare the Indonesian experience of soldiers in the streets with what it's like for an American to see a soldier in the street. The reaction is, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. You should go back to the barracks. And if we see them on the street, we presume that there's an emergency, right? That there's something really wrong. And there's conditions under which that would be legitimate, like if there's an insurrection, or if there is like a flood or a fire or an earthquake, or a terrorist attack. Yes, the military should be there for that. But as a normal matter, they belong in the barracks, and the civilian government, the civilian bureaucracy should be doing these things.
Thank you. So we still have another 5 to 8 minutes. So I would like to invite our audience. Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you for Mr. Tom to create sorry.
Dalam bahasa Indonesia bisa. Itu.
Oh,
Bahasa Indonesia nggak apa-apa.
Karena saya nggak terlalu percaya diri berbicara bahasa Inggris.
Sama saya dengan bahasa Indonesia.
Oke, saya punya pertanyaan yang sebenarnya ini banyak kaitannya dengan pengalaman saya sebagai seorang periset, khususnya riset-riset sosial yang udah pernah saya alami selama ini. Dan kalau misalnya kaitannya dengan demokrasi, saya itu punya concern terkait dengan bagaimana sih antara level pendidikan masyarakat dan kesenjangan pengetahuan masyarakat di Indonesia itu kan sangat punya standarnya kalau nggak rendah, gapnya sangat tinggi antara yang elit ataupun antara orang-orang masyarakat miskin umumnya gitu. Nah, yang saya punya pandangan ketika kita berbicara politik atau demokrasi di masyarakat, itu saya menilai kalau masyarakat itu punya budaya permisif, maaf kalau agak kasar, tapi permisif dan agak mungkin memiliki kecenderungan untuk membiarkan gitu. Maksudnya ketika kita di masa-masa pemilu ataupun masa-masa kayak election ataupun tidak election pun kita itu tidak melihat politisi dengan melalui gagasan atau visi yang dia ciptakan, yang dia keluarkan, tapi kita lebih melihat pada persona, karismatik, atau bahkan hal-hal konteks personal yang sebenarnya itu harus dilepaskan ketika kita berbicara, ketika kita ingin memilih pejabat publik gitu. Nah, bagaimana Indonesia bisa disebut sebagai negara yang sukses mengalami demokrasi ketika kondisi pendidikannya cukup rendah dengan gap ketimpangan yang tinggi ditambah dengan kultur ataupun psikologis masyarakat Indonesia itu sebenarnya rata-rata juga tidak memiliki visi politik yang yang rata itu. Manusia punya masyarakat punya visinya masing-masing gitu. Terima kasih.
Sama-sama. I will respond in English kalau boleh. Because you are talking, your question is really fundamental, and I can answer it by my understanding of Indonesian politics, but I'm very influenced by my position as an American and my own beliefs about how politics works. And so as an American, I don't trust any politician ever, right? Like it's just like a fundamental belief that like I am choosing the least worst option at all times, right? I'm only trying to guard against the bad outcome, a worse outcome by choosing the least bad outcome. I view choosing politicians like choosing the road to work, like when I'm driving to work. I don't like driving this street or this street or this street. One isn't better or worse. I choose the one that gets me there fastest. And I would drive a different route if it got me there fastest. Like I have no inherent interest in the route that I take. I only choose the one that is most convenient, right? So I don't believe that. So this is a really I don't mean to reject your point, but I'm just giving you a different perspective. Then I'm going to build on it, which is to say that I don't expect politicians to have a vision that I really believe in. I want to choose the one who thinks that they have an incentive to tell me what I want to hear, because that one is going to act the way that I want more frequently than one who does not, right? So it's a very pessimistic view of politics, very pessimistic view of democracy. But when American politicians get up in front of the stage and they talk about their ideologies, I believe that they're lying. And I believe that they don't mean it. I believe that they're telling me manis manisan, right? Whatever I want to hear, so that I will. And if there's somebody who won't even pretend to do what I want, I won't vote for them. I want to vote for the one who I think is pretending to tell me what I want. And it's very easy for me to pick politicians this way. I don't fall in love with politicians. I don't I don't have idols, right? And I believe that they're always doing things in their own interest. And so I want to pick the one whose own interest is closest to mine. Okay, now, begini. So now let me respond to your question. When I hear the question of voters are voting based on charisma, right? Or appeal, right? Or demographics, right? I vote for the person who looks like me, or the person who's the same type of person as me. That doesn't bother me that much, right? I don't think that's a major problem. I think instead, the thing that, if talking about education and what Indonesians should be educated to believe, is they should be educated to believe, or that they should develop the belief that politicians are their employees and that they can fire them. And they fire them whenever they behave improperly. And so that to me is the core quality of democracy that Indonesia is missing, right? And so and it's also missing in America too, so you're not alone. It's difficult around the world. But when I hear things like revolution mental, remember revolution mental? This idea we're going to get the right type of beliefs, right? Sorry. Yeah. We're going to get the right type of mindset to be a great people and a great nation. I think that the real revolution mental is to believe that politicians are our employees and that we fire them if they don't behave properly. We fire them for cause, right? And I don't care what they look like, and I don't care if they're like me or not. If you are a different ethnicity, a different religion, have different beliefs, but you serve my interests, then that's fine. That's a very democratic thing to think, that I don't care what you look like, I don't care what you act like, but do you serve me? And if you don't, I will fire you. Doesn't matter. Again, returning to the US context, we're having a great test of this right now with the new mayor of New York City, Zoran Mamdani, right? I said before, I don't have idols. I'm a little bit. Zoran Mamdani is kind of like, boy, I wish I was him. He's so attractive, right? I can admit it, right? He's attractive. He's smart. He's charismatic. He says what he believes, even when it's unpopular. What matters to me is not what his ideals are, collectivism, democratic socialism. I presume he doesn't mean any of that. I presume that he wants to get elected, and he'll do the things that get him elected, which means he'll try to act in ways that serve the interests of the people. And if he does that, good, let's vote for him again. And if he won't do that, throw him out, right? He's useless. He's just my employee. And I think he believes that and understands that, which makes him attractive to me. But apply this then, and I'll stop here, to the Indonesian context. I think ideology matters a lot, and I think charisma matters a lot. Politicians do need to get attention. A charismatic politician, that's a real resource. But if the charisma doesn't come with service, if it doesn't come with action, if it doesn't come with performance, then I don't care about that charisma. Right? The charismatic politician who can get things done in the interest of the people is just fine. And if he or she looks different than me or acts different than me, has from a different party, then I don't care, just so long as they serve the people. So that's revolution mental, khas Pepinski.
All right. So thank you so much, Pak Tom Pepinski. So I think I would like to close this Forum Populi with 3 points. The 3 takeaway points from based on our discussion is the first, in Southeast Asia, the state of democracy it's tidak baik-baik saja. Ya, tidak baik-baik saja. Only in Malaysia is going to the right direction, and our lovely neighbor, Timor-Leste. So those two countries are the only country in Southeast Asia that going to the right direction. And
Let me also add,
yeah,
Indonesia is still better than everybody else, except for those two.
okay, that is the most important thing. Indonesia is still in a better position compared to other Southeast Asian countries. And also, it's very interesting that Pak Tom earlier mentioned that the pressing issues in Southeast Asia, according from his own perspective, is environment. So geopolitics on ASEAN and also economic transition um, is important, are important, but environmental degradation is the most pressing issues, and we in Indonesia also um, faced with that threat as well. Like the natural disaster in Sumatra in November is a clear example that we have to really pay attention on this issue. And then the third is the legacy of authoritarianism is still persists, not only institutionally but also culturally, as uh, based on the questions that raised by Yugo and also through Zoom that mentioned about the militarism, about why military involvement in politics. That is a legacy of authoritarianism, and yeah, so we have to deal with that. And then the last, and I think this is the most important, is about the very logic of democracy is about the direction of accountability. So if we want to build strong democracy, then we need to keep in mind that the politicians are the servant, and we as a voters, we are served by them. So politician is not an idol, public officials is not an idol. They are the servant of the people, and we pay them through our taxes, unless if you don't pay tax. So so that is the very logic that is missing in this country. And I think one of the reason of the American independence is because no taxation without representation. You can tax us, you can taxes us, but once you tax us, then you agree to be our server. So that is the very logic of democracy that we have to uh, build starting from now, I think. So thank you very much, Dr. Pepinski. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and thank you for everyone. Selamat sore. Terima kasih.